He thought his empire was unshakable, until one woman's secret threatened to bring it all crashing down. "Hello, my wonderful family. I'm your brother, Mr. Harrington. May the Almighty cover your homes with mercy, bless your children with wisdom, and heal every broken heart among us. May joy never leave your household, and may your love always be protected. Each story I share is my offering of love and strength. Watch until the end, and together we'll keep this family strong. If your soul is with us, write present. If you walk with love, write I am with Mr. Harrington." Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next powerful story we share. Subscribe, like, and share this video, so together we can reach more beautiful minds like yours. Today's story is about a love that was stolen by lies. About a woman forced to vanish into the shadows, carrying the most dangerous secret of all. It's about power, betrayal, and the moment when the past refuses to stay buried. 7 years ago, Alexander Sterling believed he knew everything about trust and betrayal. He was wrong. The woman he thought had deceived him had actually been protecting the one thing that could change his life forever. But secrets have a way of finding the light, no matter how deep you bury them. In a small community center, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, destiny would stop pretending to be patient. A billionaire would walk through a doorway expecting nothing more than a routine charity visit. Instead, he would come face to face with a truth that would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew. The child laughing in the corner had his eyes, his smile, his stubborn chin. And in that moment, the most powerful man in the city became powerless. The CEO froze. The child she tried to hide looked just like him. 7 years ago, the world looked different through Camille Johnson's eyes. She was 22. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 43rd floor of Sterling Global Enterprises, watching the city stretch endlessly before her. Her reflection stared back, rich brown skin glowing in the afternoon light, deep expressive eyes that held dreams too big for the small apartment she called home, and a quiet strength that made people stop and take notice. Camille wasn't supposed to be anything more than a secretary. File papers, answer phones, schedule meetings for men in expensive suits who barely remembered her name. But Sterling Global was different. The company pulsed with ambition, and somehow, that energy found its way into her blood. She had grown up in neighborhoods where dreams felt like luxuries most people couldn't afford. Her mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Her father left when she was 7, promising to send money that never came. But Camille refused to accept that her zip code determined her destiny. She studied at night, worked weekends, and earned her way into Sterling Global through pure determination. The other secretaries whispered about her. How she stayed late reviewing financial reports that weren't part of her job. How she asked questions during meetings when she should have been invisible. How she dared to suggest improvements to processes that had worked fine for years. They called her ambitious like it was a disease. But there was one person who noticed Camille for all the right reasons. Alexander Sterling moved through his empire like a force of nature. At 36, he had transformed his family's already successful company into a global powerhouse that touched every continent. His piercing blue eyes could freeze a room or ignite a boardroom debate with equal intensity. When Alexander entered a space, conversations stopped. Deals worth millions hung on his words. World leaders returned his calls. Yet for all his power, Alexander Sterling was a man who had forgotten how to feel surprised. Until Camille Johnson walked into his corner office one Tuesday morning with a proposal that would save his company $2 million. She shouldn't have been there. His usual assistant was sick, and Camille was covering. She was supposed to bring coffee and leave quietly. Instead, she stood there with a file folder in her hands and fire in her eyes, explaining how Sterling Global was hemorrhaging money on redundant overseas shipping contracts. Alexander had been reviewing contracts for 20 years. He had teams of analysts whose only job was finding inefficiencies. Yet here was his temporary secretary, pointing out a problem that could have bankrupted a smaller company. "How did you know about this?" he asked, his voice carrying that edge that made grown men stammer. Camille didn't stammer. She met his gaze directly and said, "Because I pay attention, Mr. Sterling. And I care about this company's success." That was the moment everything changed. Their relationship began in the spaces between professional duties. Late nights when the building emptied and only the cleaning crew remained. Strategy sessions that stretched past midnight, fueled by takeout containers and shared ambition. Camille's desk gradually moved closer to Alexander's office until she became his unofficial advisor on deals that could make or break careers. She challenged him in ways no one else dared. When he wanted to expand into South American markets, she presented research showing why Asia offered better long-term opportunities. When he considered firing an underperforming division, she showed him how restructuring could salvage millions in assets. Alexander had surrounded himself with yes-men for so long that Camille's honest opposition felt like oxygen. But their connection went deeper than business strategy. In those quiet hours when the city slept below them, Alexander found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone. About the pressure of living up to his father's legacy. About the loneliness that came with being untouchable. About how sometimes he looked in the mirror and wondered if the man staring back was someone worth knowing. Camille listened without judgment. She told him about growing up in a world where a dollar had to stretch for days. About her mother's calloused hands and her own determination to build something better. About nights when she dreamed of boardrooms and corner offices, only to wake up knowing most people would tell her those dreams were too big for someone like her. Someone like you? Alexander asked one night, genuinely puzzled. A black girl from the South Side with a community college degree, Camille said simply. The world has very specific ideas about what people like me are supposed to want. Alexander realized he had never thought about the barriers Camille faced just walking into his building every morning. The assumptions people made. The extra scrutiny. The way she had to work twice as hard to earn half the credit. It made her achievements even more remarkable. Somewhere in those shared confessions and quiet moments, the impossible happened. Alexander Sterling, the man who trusted no one and needed nothing, fell in love with the woman who saw him as more than his net worth. Camille felt it too. The way her heart jumped when he entered a room. How his rare smiles seemed meant only for her. The electricity in the air when their fingers brushed reaching for the same document. She tried to tell herself it was just gratitude for his recognition of her abilities. But late at night, alone in her small apartment, she couldn't lie to herself anymore. They were falling into something dangerous and beautiful and completely impossible. But every love story has someone determined to write a different ending. Victoria Hayes had been part of Alexander's world since college. Their families moved in the same circles, attended the same charity galas, belonged to the same exclusive clubs. She was everything society expected Alexander Sterling to want. Blonde perfection with a trust fund to match, an MBA from Wharton, and a smile that had graced the covers of lifestyle magazines. Victoria had been Alexander's business partner for 5 years and his rumored fiancée for 3. The press loved them together. Power couple. Perfect match. The wedding everyone was waiting for. Except Alexander had never actually proposed. Victoria told herself it was just a matter of timing. Alexander was focused on expansion. Once the Asian market stabilized, once the merger with Harrison Industries finalized, once the quarterly reports exceeded projections, there was always something more important than making their relationship official. But then Victoria noticed the changes. How Alexander stayed at the office later. How his attention seemed divided during business dinners. How he smiled at his phone when he thought no one was looking. At first, she assumed it was another business deal consuming his focus. Alexander had always been obsessive about work. But Victoria Hayes hadn't climbed to the top of one of the city's most prestigious marketing firms by ignoring details that mattered. She started paying attention to the patterns. The coffee cups in Alexander's office that weren't his usual order. The way he suddenly knew details about community development projects that had never interested him before. The fact that his temporary secretary had been working temporarily for 6 months. Victoria began watching Camille Johnson. What she saw made her blood turn cold. The way Alexander's eyes lingered when Camille entered the room. How his voice softened when he spoke to her. The way Camille looked at him like he was the answer to questions she'd been asking her whole life. Victoria had spent years building her claim on Alexander Sterling. She had turned down marriage proposals from senators and tech moguls, waiting for the moment when Alexander would realize they belonged together. She had restructured her entire life around becoming Mrs. Alexander Sterling. She would not lose him to a secretary from the wrong side of town. Victoria's plan unfolded with surgical precision. She started small, casual comments about employee fraternization policies. Concerns about how the relationship between Alexander and his assistant might look to potential investors. Suggestions that perhaps Camille's rapid rise in responsibility was creating office gossip. When subtle manipulation didn't work, Victoria escalated. She hired a private investigator to dig into Camille's background. There had to be something. A criminal record, financial troubles, family drama, anything that could prove Camille was using Alexander for her own gain. But the investigation came back clean. Camille Johnson was exactly what she appeared to be, a brilliant woman who had earned every opportunity through merit. So Victoria decided to manufacture the evidence she needed. It started with documents. Financial projections that appeared on Camille's computer without her knowledge. Emails from competing companies that Camille had never sent. Phone records showing calls to industry rivals that never happened. Victoria's connections ran deep in the corporate world. A favor here, a payment there, and suddenly Camille Johnson looked like a woman with secrets to sell. The final piece was a photograph. Camille having lunch with a man Victoria's investigator identified as a reporter from Business Weekly. The photo was real. Camille was meeting with her cousin Marcus, who worked in journalism but had never written a business story in his life. But context was everything, and Victoria was an expert at controlling narrative. She presented the evidence to Alexander on a Thursday morning, spreading the documents across his desk like tarot cards revealing an ugly future. "I'm sorry to bring this to you," Victoria said, her voice heavy with manufactured concern. "But I thought you should know what your secretary has been doing." Alexander stared at the papers. Financial data from confidential meetings. Email addresses he didn't recognize. The photograph of Camille with a stranger, both of them laughing like old friends. "This has to be a mistake," Alexander said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I hoped so too," Victoria replied. "But look at the bank deposits. She's been receiving payments from Harrison Industries for months. Right around the time we started negotiations with them." The numbers were damning. The timeline was perfect. And the woman Alexander thought he knew suddenly looked like a stranger capable of betrayal. Alexander had been burned by trust before. His first business partner had stolen clients and fled to Singapore with $500,000. A college friend had sold Alexander's expansion plans to a competitor for enough money to start his own company. Alexander had learned to be suspicious of everyone's motives. But Camille was supposed to be different. The confrontation happened on a Friday evening. Alexander waited until the building emptied, then called Camille into his office. She arrived expecting another late-night strategy session. Instead, she found the evidence of her supposed betrayal spread across the conference table. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Alexander asked, his voice as cold as winter wind. Camille looked at the documents with genuine confusion. "I don't understand. What is this?" "This is you selling confidential information to our competitors," Alexander said. "This is you playing a role so convincingly that I actually believed you cared about this company. About me." The hurt in Camille's eyes was so raw it almost made Alexander reconsider. "Almost. Alexander, I would never." "The evidence speaks for itself." He held up the photograph. "Who is this man?" "That's my cousin Marcus," Camille said desperately. "He's a sports journalist. We were celebrating his engagement. Alexander, please, you have to believe me. I would never betray you or this company. I love." "Don't." Alexander's voice cut through her words like glass. "Don't make this worse with lies." Camille felt her world crashing down around her. 7 months of late nights, shared dreams, and growing love disintegrated in the space of a conversation. The man she had fallen for was staring at her like she was poison. "You're fired," Alexander said simply. "Security will escort you out. Don't come back." Camille wanted to fight, to demand he investigate further. to make him see that someone was manipulating them both. But the look in his eyes told her it was already too late. Alexander Sterling had made up his mind, and nothing she said would change it. She cleared out her desk in silence while a security guard watched. Her hands shook as she packed the few personal items she'd brought to work. A photo of her mother. A small plant she'd been nurturing by the window. The book of poetry Alexander had mentioned loving, which she'd bought hoping to understand him better. As she walked toward the elevator for the last time, Camille felt the weight of a secret she couldn't share. The morning sickness she'd been attributing to stress. The missed period she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. The positive pregnancy test she'd taken 3 days ago and hidden in her purse, waiting for the right moment to tell the father. That moment would never come. Alexander Sterling had made his choice. He believed the worst about her without question. He trusted manufactured evidence over the woman who had shared his dreams and his bed. But Camille Johnson carried something more precious than his trust. She carried his child. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Camille made a promise to the life growing inside her. She would disappear completely. She would build a new life somewhere Alexander Sterling could never find them. She would raise their child with love and strength and the knowledge that some people were too dangerous to trust with your heart. Alexander never looked for her. In his mind, Camille Johnson was just another person who had tried to use him. Another lesson in why emotional attachments were liabilities he couldn't afford. 7 years passed like pages in a book Alexander never wanted to read. Camille Johnson, now 29, had kept every promise she made to herself. She'd moved across the country to a small city where no one knew her story. She worked double shifts at a local diner, saving every dollar she could. She rented a tiny 2-bedroom apartment where the heat sometimes didn't work but the windows faced east so her son could wake up to sunshine. Noah Sterling Johnson, though he only knew the Johnson part, had grown into a miracle of a child. 7 years old with storm blue eyes that mirrored his father's, a stubborn chin that came from both sides of his genetics, and a laugh that could light up the darkest days. He was brilliant like his mother, curious about everything, and gentle with others in a way that made teachers and neighbors fall in love with him immediately. Camille had never told Noah about his father. How could she explain that the most powerful man in the city didn't know his son existed? That she had chosen to raise Noah alone rather than risk Alexander's rejection hurting her child the way it had destroyed her? Instead, she built their life around love and possibility. Noah played Little League baseball and took piano lessons. He read voraciously and asked questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether aliens existed. He was everything good about both his parents, untainted by the bitterness and betrayal that had driven them apart. But secrets have a way of demanding recognition, especially when they carry Alexander Sterling's distinctive features and Camille Johnson's unshakable spirit. The charity event at the Riverside Community Center was Camille's idea. She had been volunteering there for 3 years, helping organize activities for local children. The center needed funding for new playground equipment, and Camille suggested hosting a family day to raise awareness and donations from local businesses. She never imagined Sterling Global Enterprises would be one of the companies that responded to their outreach. Noah was excited about the event for weeks. He helped Camille make decorations, practiced his piano piece for the talent show, and talked endlessly about all the games they would play. For him, it was just another adventure. For Camille, it was a chance to give back to the community that had welcomed them with open hearts. The morning of the event, Camille dressed carefully in a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes. She braided Noah's hair the way he liked it and made sure his favorite shirt was clean. They arrived early to help set up tables and hang streamers. Noah ran off to play with other children while Camille arranged chairs and checked the sound system. She was testing the microphone when she felt the shift in the room's energy. Conversations quieted. Whispers started. Someone important had arrived. Camille looked up and felt time stop. Alexander Sterling stood in the doorway of the community center like a vision from another lifetime. 7 years had made him more distinguished, silver threading through his dark hair, lines around his eyes that spoke of decisions and stress and power. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Camille made in 6 months. His presence commanded the room the same way it always had. But it was his expression that made Camille's heart stop beating. Alexander's piercing blue eyes had found Noah. Her son was laughing with a group of children near the small stage, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. The late morning sun streaming through the windows caught his features perfectly. The strong jaw, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, the unmistakable Sterling eyes that had been passed down through generations. Alexander Sterling, the man who had built an empire on his ability to read people and situations in seconds, needed only one glance to understand the truth. His face went white. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. His mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to speak but had forgotten how words worked. For the first time in years, the ruthless billionaire CEO looked powerless. Tell me in the comments, would you have trusted Alexander at this point? Or would you have run, just like Camille did? Let me know your thoughts. Alexander's world tilted on its axis. The sounds of children playing, volunteers laughing, music from the small stage, all of it faded into white noise. His vision tunneled until there was nothing but the boy with his eyes, his chin, his unmistakable genetic signature written across features that belonged to a child he'd never known existed. The resemblance wasn't subtle. It was devastating in its clarity. Noah had Alexander's strong jawline, the same way of tilting his head when concentrating, and those piercing blue eyes that had been passed down through 3 generations of Sterling men. But there was something else, the gentle curve of his smile, the warmth in his expression, the way he moved with natural grace. That was all Camille. Alexander's legs felt unsteady. His hands trembled slightly as the magnitude of what he was seeing crashed over him like a tidal wave. This wasn't some cruel coincidence. This wasn't his imagination playing tricks. This was his son. His son. The words echoed in his mind like thunder. He had a child. A 7-year-old boy who was laughing and playing and completely unaware that his father was standing 30 feet away, drowning in the realization of everything he'd missed. First words. First steps. Birthdays. Christmas mornings. Bedtime stories. 7 years of moments that could never be recovered. Camille had seen Alexander the moment he walked through the door. Her body had gone cold with recognition and terror. She'd spent 7 years building a life designed around this moment never happening. Every precaution taken, every choice made, every mile traveled, all to ensure that Alexander Sterling would never discover the truth about Noah. But fate had found them anyway. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might burst. 7 years of secrets, 7 years of protection, 7 years of carefully constructed lies were crashing down in one terrible moment. The life she'd built, the safety she'd created, the peace she'd found, all of it hung in the balance as Alexander's shocked gaze moved from Noah to her. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and time stopped. No words were needed. The truth was written in the air between them, as clear and undeniable as the child who carried both their features. Alexander knew. Camille knew he knew. And in that moment, everything changed. The recognition in Alexander's eyes wasn't just about Noah. It was about her. About what they'd had. About what had been destroyed by lies and manipulation. About the woman who had disappeared carrying the most precious secret in the world. Alexander's face cycled through emotions like a broken slideshow. Shock gave way to realization. Realization melted into something that looked like grief. And underneath it all, a growing anger that had nothing to do with Camille and everything to do with the 7 years that had been stolen from him. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't approach. He just stood there, staring at the life he'd never known existed, trying to process the impossible truth that his son was real and breathing and beautiful and completely, utterly unknown to him. Other people in the community center had begun to notice the tension. Conversations quieted as they sensed something significant happening, though they couldn't understand what. The Sterling Global volunteers looked confused. They'd expected their CEO to make his usual brief appearance, shake a few hands, write a check, and leave. Instead, he was frozen like a man who'd seen a ghost. Noah, innocent and unaware of the emotional earthquake happening around him, finished his conversation with the other children and skipped over to Camille. His joy was infectious, his energy boundless, his love for his mother written across his face in a smile that could have powered the entire building. "Mama," he said, tugging on her dress, Mrs. Rodriguez says we can do the talent show now. Can I play my piano piece? The one I've been practicing. Camille's throat closed. Her voice had disappeared somewhere in the chaos of seeing Alexander again, of watching him discover Noah, of realizing that the careful walls she'd built around their life were about to come tumbling down. Mama. Noah's voice carried a note of concern now. He was a perceptive child, sensitive to his mother's moods in the way that children who'd only ever had one parent learn to be. Are you okay? You look scared. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that the stranger across the room is the father who never knew he existed? How do you tell your child that the man staring at him with such intensity holds the power to change everything they've ever known about their life? I'm fine, baby, Camille whispered, her voice barely audible. Just give me a minute, okay? But Noah had followed her gaze. His curious blue eyes, so heartbreakingly similar to Alexander's, had found the man in the expensive suit who was staring at them with an expression Noah couldn't interpret. Mama, who is that man? Noah asked, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper children use when they sense adult secrets. Why is he looking at us like that? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Camille felt the weight of 7 years of careful truths and protective lies pressing down on her shoulders. She'd always known this moment might come. She'd rehearsed explanations in her mind 1,000 times. But standing here, with Alexander's eyes boring into her soul and Noah's innocent curiosity demanding answers, every prepared word disappeared. I don't know, sweetie, she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Maybe he likes your shirt. Noah looked down at his favorite t-shirt, the blue one with a cartoon dinosaur that Camille had bought him for his birthday. It is a pretty cool shirt, he agreed with the easy acceptance of childhood. Should we go say hi? No. The word came out sharper than Camille intended, sharp enough to make Noah flinch slightly. She immediately softened her tone. No, baby. I think we should go home now. But the talent show. We'll do it next time, okay? There will be other talent shows. Noah's face fell with a particular disappointment that only children could express so purely. But he was a good kid, raised to trust his mother's judgment even when he didn't understand it. Okay, Mama. Can we get ice cream on the way home? Yes, Camille said, her voice thick with unshed tears. We can get whatever you want. She grabbed Noah's hand, perhaps a little too tightly, and began moving toward the exit. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run. To get Noah out of there before Alexander could approach them, before he could start asking questions, before he could turn their carefully ordered world upside down. But Alexander Sterling hadn't become a billionaire by letting opportunities slip away. He moved with the same decisive purpose that had built his empire, cutting through the crowd with long strides that ate up the distance between them. He wasn't thinking about propriety or public scenes or the implications of his actions. He was thinking about the boy whose hand Camille held, the child who shared his DNA and his stubborn chin and 7 years of history that belonged to Alexander by right. Camille. Her name on his lips stopped her cold. She'd forgotten how he said it, with just a slight emphasis on the second syllable that made it sound like music. She'd forgotten the way his voice could command attention without raising in volume. She'd forgotten how the simple act of him speaking her name could make her feel seen in a way that no one else ever had. She turned slowly, Noah's small hand still clasped in hers. Alexander was close enough now that she could see the silver threading through his hair, the new lines around his eyes, the way 7 years had refined his features without diminishing their impact. Alexander, she said quietly. His name felt foreign on her tongue after so many years of not saying it, of pretending he didn't exist in any world that mattered to her. They stared at each other across a distance that felt both infinite and microscopic. 7 years of silence. 7 years of questions. 7 years of a life built on the foundation of his absence. We need to talk, Alexander said, his voice different than she remembered. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. For the first time since she'd known him, Alexander Sterling looked vulnerable. About what? Camille whispered, though they both knew exactly what. The question was a delaying tactic, a desperate attempt to buy herself a few more seconds before the conversation that would change everything. Alexander's gaze dropped to Noah, who was watching this exchange with the fascination children reserved for adult drama they didn't quite understand. When Alexander's eyes met his son's for the first time with full knowledge of their connection, something shifted in his expression. The businessman disappeared, replaced by something deeper and more primal. "About my son," Alexander said, and those 3 words changed everything. Noah's head whipped up to look at his mother, confusion and curiosity warring across his features. "Mama? What does he mean?" Camille felt the earth shift beneath her feet. There was no more hiding, no more pretending, no more protecting Noah from truths that were bigger than both of them. The moment she'd spent 7 years dreading had arrived with the inevitability of sunrise. "Not here," she said to Alexander, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this." Alexander nodded, understanding immediately. Whatever conversation they needed to have, it couldn't happen in a room full of strangers with Noah caught in the middle, processing revelations that would reshape his understanding of his own identity. "Where?" Alexander asked. Camille's mind raced. Her apartment was too small, too intimate, too much like inviting a hurricane into her living room. A public place felt wrong for a conversation this private. But they needed somewhere they could talk without curious eyes and innocent ears absorbing every word. "The park down the street," she said finally. "Tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock. But Alexander." She paused, her voice strengthening with maternal protectiveness. "He doesn't know. About you. About any of this. And I won't have him hurt." Alexander's expression softened slightly. "I don't want to hurt him either, Camille. I just want to understand." She nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then she turned to Noah, who had been following this conversation with growing bewilderment. "Come on, baby," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Let's go get that ice cream." As they walked toward the exit, Noah tugged on her hand. "Mama, why did that man call me his son? I thought you said my daddy went to heaven when I was little." Camille's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. The lie she'd told to protect him, the gentle fiction that had spared him the pain of abandonment, was about to crumble under the weight of truth. "We'll talk about it later, okay?" she said, knowing that later was coming whether she was ready or not. Alexander watched them leave, his son's small hand trustingly held in his mother's, and felt something he'd never experienced before. It wasn't just loss for the years he'd missed. It wasn't just anger at the circumstances that had kept them apart. It was a fierce, overwhelming need to be part of their lives, to know his child, to somehow make up for 7 years of absence. But as Camille and Noah disappeared through the community center doors, Alexander realized he wasn't the only one watching. Victoria Hayes had been following Alexander's movements for weeks. Not obviously, not intrusively, but with the careful attention of someone who understood that knowledge was power and power was everything. She'd noticed his distraction, his late nights at the office that seemed less about work and more about avoidance. She'd seen him staring out his office window with an expression she couldn't read. When Alexander announced he would personally attend the Riverside Community Center charity event, something completely out of character for a man who usually delegated such appearances to junior executives, Victoria's instincts had gone on high alert. She'd arrived at the community center 20 minutes after Alexander, expecting to find him making polite conversation with local officials and writing a perfunctory donation check. Instead, she'd witnessed something that made her blood run cold. Alexander Sterling, the man she'd been trying to marry for 7 years, had stood frozen in the doorway like a man seeing a ghost. His attention had been completely consumed by a black woman Victoria didn't recognize and a little boy whose features were unmistakably familiar. Victoria prided herself on her ability to read people and situations. It was a skill that had made her one of the most successful marketing executives in the city. And everything about Alexander's reaction to the woman and child screamed personal history of the most dangerous kind. She'd taken photos with her phone. Discreet, professional-quality images that captured the intensity of Alexander's focus, the woman's obvious distress, and most importantly, the child's face. A child with Alexander's eyes, Alexander's stubborn chin, and Alexander's genetic signature written across features that couldn't be denied. Victoria had spent the 7 years since Camille Johnson's disappearance believing that threat had been permanently eliminated. She destroyed Camille's reputation, driven her from Alexander's life, and assumed that whatever connection they'd shared had died with distance and time. She'd been catastrophically wrong. The private investigator's report landed on Victoria's desk 3 days later like a nuclear weapon wrapped in manila folder. Photos of Alexander parked outside a modest apartment complex. Images of him following a woman and child through grocery store aisles. Documentation of surveillance that revealed the truth Victoria had spent years trying to bury. Camille Johnson was alive. She was living in the city. And she had a 7-year-old son who looked exactly like Alexander Sterling. Victoria stared at the photographs spread across her mahogany desk, her manicured fingers tracing the edges of images that represented the collapse of everything she'd built. The timeline was damning. Camille had disappeared 7.5 years ago. The boy appeared to be 7. The math was simple and devastating. Alexander had a son. A son he'd never known about. A son who could destroy everything Victoria had worked for. But Victoria Hayes hadn't climbed to the top of her profession by accepting defeat. She'd built her career on turning crises into opportunities, on finding ways to make other people's weaknesses serve her purposes. And this situation, as threatening as it appeared, was just another puzzle to be solved. If Alexander had a secret child, that secret was a weapon. The question was whether to use it to destroy him or control him. Victoria picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. Marcus Thorne was the most ruthless family law attorney in the state, a man who specialized in high-stakes custody battles and wasn't particular about which side of justice his clients fell on. "Marcus," she said when he answered, "I have a situation that requires your particular expertise." "What kind of situation?" "The kind where a powerful man discovers he has a child he's never met, and that child is being raised by a woman with a questionable past and limited resources." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus Thorne had handled enough delicate situations to recognize the implications immediately. How questionable is the past? Victoria smiled, a cold expression that would have made Alexander's blood freeze if he could have seen it. "Corporate espionage. Theft of trade secrets. I have documentation." And the child? 7 years old. Living in substandard conditions with a mother who works multiple jobs and can barely keep a roof over their heads. Another pause. "What's your interest in this?" "Let's just say I have a vested interest in ensuring the child ends up in a stable home with proper parents." Marcus understood immediately. Victoria wasn't calling as a concerned citizen. She was calling as a woman who saw an opportunity to eliminate a threat while positioning herself as the solution. "It's doable," Marcus said finally. "Especially if the father is willing to fight for custody. A man with resources versus a single mother with a criminal background. The courts tend to favor stability. And if the father isn't initially cooperative, then we make him understand that cooperation is in everyone's best interest, including his own." Victoria's smile widened. "I'll send you everything by the end of the day." She hung up and immediately placed another call, this time to a contact at one of the city's most prominent tabloid publications. The story was too perfect to waste. Billionaire CEO discovers secret love child, dramatic reunion, questions about the mother's past and present fitness as a parent. With the right spin, it could be presented as a heartwarming tale of family reunification. Or it could be painted as a scandal that raised serious questions about Alexander's judgment and character. The angle would depend entirely on Alexander's willingness to see reason. Victoria crafted her strategy with the precision of a chess grandmaster. First, she would let Alexander discover the full scope of his situation. Let him spend time with the child. Let himself become emotionally invested. Let him realize how much he'd missed and how much he stood to lose. Then she would present her solution. Marriage to Victoria would provide stability for the child, legitimacy for Alexander, and protection from the kind of publicity that could destroy careers and custody arrangements. She would become Noah's stepmother, a role that would give her legal standing while neutralizing Camille's influence. Alexander would get his son, Noah would get a proper family, and Camille would get enough money to disappear permanently. It was a perfect plan with only one potential flaw. It required Alexander to choose pragmatism over whatever residual feelings he might have for Camille Johnson. But Victoria had spent 7 years studying Alexander Sterling. She understood his weaknesses, his priorities, and his capacity for compartmentalizing personal desires in favor of practical outcomes. He was a businessman first, and businessmen made decisions based on logic, not emotion. She picked up her phone one more time and dialed Alexander's direct line. "Victoria," his voice was distracted when he answered, distant in a way that confirmed her suspicions about where his attention had been focused. "Alexander, darling, I was hoping we could have dinner tonight. There are some things we need to discuss." "I'm busy tonight." "It's important, Alexander. About your future. About the decisions you'll need to make very soon." There was a long pause. Victoria could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, the questions forming about what she might know and how she might know it. "What kind of decisions?" he asked carefully. "The kind that will determine whether you're a father or just a man who happened to contribute DNA to a child's existence," Victoria said smoothly. 7 o'clock at Giovanni's. Don't be late." She ended the call before he could respond, leaving him with the unmistakable impression that his world was about to become much more complicated than he'd imagined. Because Victoria Hayes had learned something important about power over the years, the person who controlled the information controlled the outcome. And she had no intention of letting anyone else write the ending to this story. Alexander stared at his phone long after the line went dead, Victoria's words echoing in his mind like a threat wrapped in silk. She knew. Somehow, Victoria knew about Noah, about Camille, about the secret that had just exploded into his life like a grenade in a sanctuary. The question was how much she knew, and more importantly, what she planned to do with that knowledge. Alexander had built his empire by making impossible choices, by weighing options and calculating outcomes with the cold precision of a machine. But as he sat in his office, staring out at the city that stretched endlessly below him, he realized that this wasn't a business decision. This was about his son. His flesh and blood. The child he'd never known existed, but who had already changed everything simply by breathing. And for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling wasn't sure he was strong enough to make the choice that logic demanded. Do you believe love can survive this kind of betrayal? Can Alexander and Camille find their way back to each other, or is Victoria's manipulation too powerful? Share your thoughts below. Alexander Sterling had fought countless battles in his 36 years. Hostile takeovers that lasted months. Board meetings that determined the fate of thousands of employees. Negotiations where billions of dollars hung in the balance. He had stared down senators, intimidated foreign ministers, and built an empire through sheer force of will. But he had never fought a battle like this one. Not for money. Not for power. For his son. The meeting with Victoria at Giovanni's had lasted exactly 12 minutes. Long enough for her to lay out her ultimatum with surgical precision. Long enough for Alexander to understand that she held weapons capable of destroying everything he'd just discovered. Long enough for him to realize that some choices couldn't be made with logic alone. Victoria had been thorough in her manipulation. The custody papers were already drawn up. The private investigator's report painted Camille as an unstable single mother living paycheck to paycheck. The character assassination was complete. Corporate spy, security risk, unfit parent. All lies, but lies wrapped in enough legal documentation to convince a family court judge who didn't know the truth about what had really happened 7 years ago. "You have 48 hours, Victoria had said, her voice as cold as winter steel. "Marry me, and Noah gets the stable home he deserves. Refuse, and I'll make sure that boy ends up in foster care while his parents fight a custody battle that will destroy you both." Alexander had left the restaurant feeling like a man walking toward his own execution. Every option Victoria presented led to the same place, Camille losing Noah, and Alexander being forced to choose between his son and any chance at happiness with the woman he'd never stopped loving. But Alexander Sterling hadn't built an empire by accepting other people's ultimatums. He drove through the city as darkness fell, his mind racing through possibilities and strategies. Victoria's plan was elegant in its cruelty, but it had one fatal flaw. It assumed Alexander would prioritize his reputation over his family. It assumed he was still the man who had let pride and suspicion drive away the best thing that had ever happened to him. He wasn't that man anymore. The moment he'd seen Noah's face, something fundamental had shifted inside him. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling had found something more important than Sterling Global Enterprises. He found himself parked outside Camille's apartment building as the streetlights flickered on. The building was older, tired around the edges, but clean and well-maintained. Through a third-floor window, he could see warm light and the shadows of movement. His son was in there, probably doing homework or playing games, completely unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down by forces beyond his control. Alexander climbed the stairs to Camille's apartment, each step feeling like a mile. He'd rehearsed what he would say during the drive over, but every word had abandoned him the moment he raised his hand to knock. Camille opened the door wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger than her 29 years. She'd been expecting him. He could see it in the resignation in her eyes, the way she held her shoulders like someone bracing for impact. "He's in his room," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him enter. "Doing math homework. He's good at math. Like you." The apartment was small but filled with love. Photos of Noah at various ages covered the refrigerator and walls. His artwork was displayed with the pride usually reserved for museum pieces. A small bookshelf overflowed with well-worn children's books and a few advanced texts that suggested Noah was reading above his grade level. This wasn't the unstable home Victoria's report had described. This was a sanctuary built by a mother who had sacrificed everything to give her child a foundation of love and security. "Camille," Alexander began, then stopped. "Where did you start a conversation about 7 years of lost time? How did you apologize for believing lies? How did you explain that you'd spent 7 years trying to forget the only woman who'd ever made you feel completely alive?" "I know why you're here," Camille said, saving him from finding the words. "Victoria called me an hour ago. She told me about the custody papers. About her generous offer to become Noah's stepmother." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Victoria doesn't speak for me. Doesn't she?" Camille's voice carried 7 years of hurt and disappointment. "She did once before. Very effectively." The reference to their past hung between them like a wall of broken glass. Alexander had spent the past few days reviewing everything he thought he knew about Camille's betrayal, examining it through the lens of Victoria's current manipulation. The patterns were impossible to ignore, the convenient timing, the perfect evidence, the way Victoria had been positioned to comfort him in the aftermath. "I was wrong," Alexander said simply. "About everything. About you." Camille's composure cracked slightly. 7 years too late, don't you think?" "I need to know him," Alexander said, his voice breaking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I need to know my son." The vulnerability in his voice stopped Camille cold. She'd seen Alexander Sterling angry, passionate, determined, and coldly professional. But she'd never seen him beg. Never seen him stripped of every defense and pretense, standing in her living room like a man who'd lost everything that mattered. "Alexander." She started, but he wasn't finished. "I've missed 7 years of his life," Alexander continued, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. 7 birthdays. 7 Christmases. First words, first steps, first days of school. I can't get those back. I know that. But I can't lose any more time with him. I won't." Camille felt her own walls beginning to crumble. This wasn't the arrogant CEO who had accused her of betrayal and watched her walk away. This was the man she'd fallen in love with in those quiet moments when the rest of the world had disappeared. The man who'd shared his fears and dreams. The man she'd never stopped loving, no matter how hard she tried. "Sit down," she said softly. "We need to talk. Really talk." They sat on opposite ends of her small couch, the space between them feeling like an ocean of time and pain and misunderstanding. But for the first time in 7 years, they talked. Not as former lovers or business associates, or even as parents negotiating custody. They talked as two people who had been torn apart by lies and were trying to find their way back to truth. Camille told him about the pregnancy. About the terror of discovering she was carrying his child while believing he thought she was a criminal. About the decision to disappear rather than risk him rejecting Noah the way he'd rejected her. About 7 years of single motherhood, of working multiple jobs, of building a life designed around keeping Noah safe and happy and unaware that his father was one of the most powerful men in the world. Alexander told her about the investigation he'd launched immediately after she left. How he'd discovered within weeks that the evidence against her had been fabricated. How he'd torn apart Victoria's story piece by piece until the truth became undeniable. How he'd searched for Camille for 2 years before accepting that she'd disappeared completely. "Why didn't you find me?" Camille asked, the question that had haunted her for years finally spoken aloud. "I tried," Alexander said, his voice thick with regret. "I hired the best investigators money could buy. But you'd covered your tracks perfectly. New name, new social security number, cash transactions only for the first year. It was like you'd vanished into thin air." "I had help," Camille admitted. "My cousin Marcus, the journalist from the photo. He knew people who knew how to disappear. I was scared that if you found me, you'd try to take Noah away." "I would have," Alexander said honestly. 7 years ago, I would have used every resource at my disposal to get custody. I would have destroyed you in court and convinced myself I was protecting him. And now..." Alexander looked toward the hallway where Noah's voice could be heard talking to himself as he worked through math problems. "Now I understand that taking him away from you would be the cruelest thing I could do to him. You're an incredible mother, Camille. He's happy, healthy, brilliant, kind. Everything good about him comes from you." Tears had started flowing down Camille's cheeks. "I never wanted to keep him from you. I wanted to tell you about the pregnancy. That night when you confronted me, I was carrying the positive test in my purse. I was going to tell you everything." "God," Alexander whispered, running his hands through his hair. "If I had just listened. If I had just trusted you." "We can't change the past," Camille said, wiping her eyes. "But we can decide what happens next." That was when Alexander told her about Victoria's ultimatum. About the custody papers, the character assassination, the threat to take Noah away from both of them if Alexander didn't marry Victoria and provide the stable home the courts would favor. "She's not bluffing," Alexander said. "Victoria has connections in family court. She has documentation that makes you look like a flight risk and me look like an absentee father. She could win." "So what do we do?" Camille asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Alexander reached across the space between them and took her hand. His fingers were warm, familiar despite the years that had passed. "We fight. Together. The way we should have 7 years ago." "I never betrayed you," Camille whispered, the words she'd needed to say for 7 years finally finding their voice. "I loved you. I loved you so much it nearly destroyed me when you didn't believe in us." Alexander brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that felt like a prayer. "I know. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." And for the first time in 7 years, Alexander Sterling cried. Not the controlled tears of a man trying to maintain his image, but the broken sobs of someone grieving for time that could never be recovered. For a woman he'd wounded. For a son he'd never known. For 7 years of loneliness that had been completely unnecessary. Camille moved closer, wrapping her arms around him the way she used to when the weight of his responsibilities became too heavy to bear alone. They held each other as the years of pain and misunderstanding finally began to heal. "Mama." Noah's voice from the hallway made them spring apart. He stood in the doorway in his pajamas, hair tousled, looking confused by the scene he'd stumbled into. "Is everything okay?" Noah asked, his young voice carrying concern that made Alexander's heart break all over again. "Everything's fine, baby," Camille said, quickly wiping her eyes. "Mr. Sterling and I were just talking." Noah studied Alexander with the unguarded curiosity of childhood. "Why were you both crying? Are you sad about something?" Alexander looked at Camille, a silent question in his eyes. How much should they tell him? How did you explain to a 7-year-old that his entire understanding of his family was about to change? Camille made the decision. "Noah, come sit with us. There's something we need to tell you." The next hour was one of the most difficult and beautiful of Alexander's life. Watching Noah process the information that Alexander was his father, seeing the questions and confusion and eventual wonder in his son's eyes, feeling the moment when Noah tentatively reached for his hand, it was overwhelming in the best possible way. Noah handled the revelation with the resilience that children possess when they feel safe and loved. He asked practical questions. Did this mean Alexander would live with them now? Could he call him Dad? Would Alexander come to his baseball games? Alexander answered each question with careful honesty, explaining that they were all figuring things out together, but that yes, he very much wanted to be Noah's father in every way that mattered. They were still talking when the knock came at the door. Camille's face went pale. It was nearly 9 o'clock on a weeknight. No one visited at this hour unless something was wrong. Alexander moved to the window and cursed under his breath. 3 black SUVs were parked outside the building. Official vehicles with government plates. Victoria, he said grimly. She's not waiting 48 hours. The knock came again, more insistent this time. A voice called out, identifying themselves as Child Protective Services, with a court order for immediate custody evaluation. Noah, go to your room, Camille said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. Pack a bag. Just in case. Mama, what's happening? Noah's voice was small, frightened by the adult fear he could sense but didn't understand. Just do what I said, baby. Everything's going to be okay. Alexander was already on his phone, calling his emergency legal team. But even as he spoke to his attorneys, he knew they were running out of time. Victoria had moved faster than he'd anticipated, using her connections to fast-track paperwork that should have taken weeks to process. When Camille opened the door, she found 2 social workers, a police officer, and Victoria Hayes herself, all standing in the hallway with official documents and satisfied expressions. Ms. Johnson, the lead social worker said, we have a court order for immediate placement of Noah Johnson into temporary protective custody pending a full family evaluation. On what grounds? Alexander demanded, stepping into view. Victoria's smile was cold and triumphant. On the grounds that the child is living in an unstable environment with a mother who has a history of corporate espionage and a father who has shown no interest in his welfare for 7 years. That's not true, Camille said, her voice stronger than she felt. Alexander has only just learned about Noah's existence. Due to Ms. Johnson's deliberate concealment, Victoria replied smoothly, which raises serious questions about her fitness as a parent and her willingness to act in the child's best interests. The social worker was reviewing the paperwork, clearly uncomfortable with the unusual circumstances, but bound by the court order in her hands. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we need to take the child tonight. He'll be placed in a certified foster home while the courts review the case. Like hell you will. The voice was Alexander's, but transformed by a fury that made everyone in the hallway step back. This wasn't the controlled businessman they expected. This was a father protecting his child. Mr. Sterling, Victoria said carefully, this doesn't have to be difficult. If you'd accept my previous offer, we could resolve this situation immediately. Noah could come home with us tonight. Alexander looked at Victoria Hayes, the woman who had manipulated him for years, destroyed his relationship with Camille, and was now threatening to tear his son away from the only mother he'd ever known. He saw her clearly for the first time, not as a business partner or potential wife, but as the architect of 7 years of unnecessary pain. Standing between Victoria and his son, Alexander spoke words that would echo through the rest of their lives. The only woman I'm marrying is Camille, he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. The only family I want is the one I should have had 7 years ago. And if you think I'm going to let you take my son from his mother, you've gravely underestimated what I'm willing to sacrifice for my family. Victoria's perfect mask finally cracked. Years of manipulation, control, and carefully laid plans crumbled in that moment. You're making a mistake, Alexander. I can give you everything: stability, respectability, social standing. She's a nobody from nowhere with nothing to offer you but complications. She gave me the most important thing in my life, Alexander replied. She gave me my son. And she loved me when I didn't deserve it. That's everything I need. The social workers were looking increasingly uncomfortable with the personal drama unfolding in front of them, but they still had a court order to execute. "Sir, regardless of your personal feelings, we still need to take the child tonight." That's when Alexander made the call that changed everything. "Senator Morrison? It's Alexander Sterling. I need a favor. A big one." Within 30 minutes, the hallway was filled with a different kind of official presence. Alexander's legal team arrived with emergency injunctions. A family court judge was roused from his evening at home to review the case files. New paperwork was filed challenging the validity of Victoria's evidence and the speed with which the custody order had been processed. But more than legal maneuvering, Alexander had deployed something Victoria couldn't match: genuine influence built on years of honest business relationships and charitable contributions. People owed Alexander favors not because he'd manipulated them, but because he'd helped them when it mattered. By midnight, the custody order had been suspended pending a full investigation into the evidence that had supported it. The social workers departed with apologies for the confusion. The police escort disappeared into the night. Victoria stood alone in the hallway, her carefully constructed world in ruins around her. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Yes, it is," Alexander replied. "You're finished, Victoria. I'm withdrawing Sterling Global's partnership with your company. I'm terminating your consulting contracts. And if you ever threaten my family again, I'll destroy everything you've built just as thoroughly as you tried to destroy mine." Victoria looked at Camille, then at Alexander, then at the closed door behind which Noah was finally safe. She'd gambled everything on her ability to control Alexander through threats and manipulation. She'd lost completely. Without another word, she walked away, her heels clicking against the floor like a countdown timer finally reaching 0. 6 months later, the world looked completely different. Noah Sterling Johnson, he'd chosen to hyphenate his name, wanting to honor both parents, was thriving in ways that amazed everyone who knew him. The shy, curious boy who'd grown up with just his mother had blossomed into a confident child who knew he was loved unconditionally by two parents who would move mountains for him. Alexander had restructured his entire life around being present for his son. Board meetings were scheduled around baseball games. Business trips included family vacations. The corner office that had once been his entire world became just one part of a life that finally felt complete. He taught Noah to throw a proper curveball, helped him with advanced math that challenged even Alexander's business school education, and read bedtime stories that sometimes put them both to sleep in Noah's room. Every moment was precious because Alexander understood how easily it could have been lost forever. Camille had quit her job at the grocery store to become Sterling Global's Director of Community Outreach, a position Alexander created specifically for her talents and passion for helping others. She'd protested that it looked like nepotism, but Alexander pointed out that no one was better qualified to design programs that actually helped working families since she'd lived that reality for 7 years. Together, they'd created scholarship programs for children from underprivileged backgrounds, job training initiatives for single parents, and childcare support that helped families stay together while building better futures. Camille's work gave her the professional fulfillment she dreamed of, while allowing her to use her experiences to help others facing similar challenges. The wedding was everything Victoria's would have been: small, intimate, focused on love rather than social standing. Noah served as Alexander's best man, a role he took seriously despite being only 7 years old. He'd practiced his speech for weeks, wanting to make sure he got the words exactly right. "My mama and my dad love each other very much," Noah had said into the microphone, his clear voice carrying to every corner of the small chapel. "And they both love me. That's what makes us a family." There hadn't been a dry eye in the building. As Alexander held his son for the first time as a married man, really held him with no fear of losing him, no uncertainty about their future, he realized something profound. Money could buy almost everything. Power could open almost any door. Influence could solve almost any problem. But none of it could buy back 7 years of missed bedtime stories. None of it could create the bond between a mother and child that Camille had nurtured through years of struggle and sacrifice. None of it could manufacture the kind of love that survived betrayal, separation, and the deliberate cruelty of people who cared more about winning than about the hearts they crushed in the process. The greatest fortune Alexander Sterling had ever accumulated wasn't measured in dollars or market share or global expansion. It was measured in a 7-year-old boy's laugh, in the way Camille looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, in the knowledge that he'd finally learned the difference between being successful and being happy. Camille watched her husband and son building a Lego spaceship on the living room floor of their new home. Not a mansion, but a place where Noah could have friends over and ride his bike in the yard and feel like a normal kid despite his father's wealth, and marveled at how far they'd all come. Sometimes the greatest love stories weren't about finding each other. Sometimes they were about finding your way back. About forgiveness. About second chances. About three broken people becoming a family that was stronger than the sum of its parts. And Noah? Noah had everything he'd never known he was missing. A father who showed up to every game, helped with homework, and loved his mother in a way that made their house feel like the safest place in the world. A mother whose strength had carried them through 7 years of uncertainty and who now got to see her dreams come true. A family that had been tested by lies and manipulation and emerged more unshakable than ever. As Alexander tucked his son into bed that night, Noah looked up at him with those familiar blue eyes and asked, "Dad, are you happy we found each other?" "More than you could ever know, buddy," Alexander replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. More than you could ever know. Do you think they made the right choice in the end? Could you have forgiven 7 years of separation? What would you have done in Camille's position? Let me know in the comments below. My beautiful family, remember this. Love isn't about perfection. It's about fighting for what matters, forgiving what hurts, and never giving up on the people who complete your heart. Camille could have chosen bitterness. She could have kept Noah's existence a secret forever, protecting herself from the pain of rejection. But love demanded courage, even when courage felt impossible. Alexander could have chosen his pride. He could have walked away rather than face the truth about his mistakes, rather than humble himself before the woman he'd wronged. But love demanded accountability, even when accountability meant admitting he'd been devastatingly wrong. Noah could have chosen anger when he learned his father hadn't been there for 7 years. Instead, he chose hope. Because children understand something adults often forget, that love isn't about the time you've lost, but about the time you choose to treasure going forward. Their story reminds us that some betrayals cut so deep they reshape our souls. That some secrets are carried not from selfishness, but from a love so protective it's willing to sacrifice its own happiness. That some people will use our deepest vulnerabilities against us, but others will fight beside us when the battle seems impossible to win. If this story touched your soul, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Share it with someone who needs to remember that love always finds a way, even when that way leads through 7 years of separation and heartbreak. And remember, we are family here. In the comments, I want to hear your stories. Have you ever fought for love against impossible odds? Have you ever had to forgive someone who broke your heart so completely you thought it could never heal? Have you ever discovered that the person you thought was your enemy was actually fighting battles you couldn't see? Your stories matter. Your hearts matter. Your journey toward love and healing and forgiveness matters. Until our next story, may love protect your heart from those who would manipulate it, and may your family know the kind of joy that comes from choosing each other every single day. I am your brother, Mr. Harrington, and I love you all.